Hey guys, I want to discuss today the idea that even evil is also a form of love. And that sounds a little bit crazy at first and it sounds wrong, but I think it's something that's important to think about, especially when you see everything that's going on today in the world. And we're seeing so much be revealed that there really is no other way to describe it than evil. It's just pure evil. And you see that, and for me, it makes me really angry. It makes me really, really angry to see some of the things that have been going on, some of the things that we've suspected but haven't been quite sure of, or at least I wasn't quite sure of. You're like, boy, I hope that's not true. And then you see, and it's like, it turns out to be true, and it makes you angry. And then you think about, well, if God is love, then how could this possibly be allowed to exist? How could this be the case? And sometimes people may want to try to hide from it and avoid it, and maybe they just, okay, I'm just going to watch sports. I'm not going to check the news. And I get it. And I think you have to be careful that you don't obsess over it too much and you don't let it destabilize you. But I also think that you can't hide from it. And these are facts of our reality, and you have to account for that. And however you think about the world and the true nature of reality, you have to take that into consideration. There is evil. It's real. It's out there. It's not all love and light among humans and among other races. There's bad stuff out there. So how could this be? How could this be allowed? Why would an infinite source consciousness allow this? Why would it allow suffering? And so I think it helps to take a step back, and think again about the concept that, we live in some sort of illusion. And, as you know, it's a tricky word to use, illusion, because it's true in a sense and it's not true in another sense. This is not an illusion in the sense that when you're inside of it, it's very, very real. And the things that you happen, the things that you do, the choices you make have a real moral weight to them. If you were to say this is just an illusion, then is there any morality at all? Can't you go up and just smack someone across the face and you say, well, why are you upset at me? It's just an illusion. It's not real. And that's not the case. This is real in a sense, but it's not real in the sense that this is a creation of consciousness and this is not the ultimate reality. And so then you have to think about, well, what is this that we're going through and that we're experiencing and that we're living in? And what we are is, we are far down on the hierarchical scale of consciousness. As the source consciousness splits itself into infinite facets, into infinite pieces. You can imagine like a gemstone with infinite facets on it, and each one is a different perspective on reality. And we're one of those perspectives, and the source consciousness does this for experience. It does this to learn about itself, to experience itself. And in doing so, it creates infinite realities and infinite dimensions. And this universe is one of them. And this physical world is one of them. And this is a reality, a place for the source consciousness, for the ultimate infinite creator to experience itself, to learn, to split off pieces of itself that individuate and then go through and have their own experiences and grow and grow and grow as individuated forms of consciousness. And that's what this is all about. And when you think about that, and then you think about good and evil, you can see that since free will is one of the primary features, one of the most important features of consciousness, and where does that ultimately derive from? From the source consciousness, and that's always going to remain a mystery. But free will is real. And so the source consciousness allows this universe to develop freely. And it allows all the pieces of itself to make their own choices. And some of the facets of consciousness, some of these individuated forms that we are surrounded by, some of them choose darkness. That's just the way it is. It just reflects the infinite variety and the infinite possibilities of the source consciousness. It contains everything. It contains the light and the dark. All of it is a part of the source consciousness. There is just one consciousness. But that consciousness is highly, highly diverse. I mean, it's infinite. I'll just keep saying infinite over and over. It's not even, it's difficult to even understand what that could possibly mean in reality. So if you think about good and evil, more from the standpoint, not of human judgment and ethics and morality, although that is an important part of it. I mean, it is valid to look at it in that way sometimes, but you should also look at it as the way that you might see the positive and negative poles on a magnet. This is something that, if you read the raw material, they describe, very wonderfully that the positive and negative poles on a magnet, in the electromagnetic sense, allow for the possibility of work. It allows work to occur. And likewise, positive and negative in terms of ethics allow, work to occur in consciousness. And this enables so many of the experiences that we go through, because if it was all just positive, it might not be such a varied and vivid experience. And the source consciousness is experiencing itself, and it's going through all the possibilities, or just, it's exploring, the infinite possibilities. And some of those possibilities contain struggle and contain suffering, and it's perfectly valid for beings, for entities, to choose the path of darkness instead of the path, of light. You can think of good and evil as, radiation and absorption. Good is to radiate light and to radiate love, and evil is to absorb it. But those are both parts of the same thing. Those are not separate things. There is no separation. There is just the one. There is just the source consciousness, and it contains within itself infinite variety. And we're experiencing that. We're living through that, and we're going through that. So it helps to, even though when you see it in your day-to-day life, in your practical day-to-day existence, it's legitimate. I understand it's perfectly fine to get upset. It's perfectly legitimate to defend yourself, to take action. Just because evil exists doesn't mean that you have to accept it and roll over. There is no rule that you have to allow yourself to be enslaved. You can fight back and you can defend yourself, but it's important to keep the concept in mind always that you should do that without judgment. And I think that's the meaning of, for example, when Jesus says, love your enemies, or when the Christians say, hate the sin, love the sinner, hate the sin. It's that concept. You don't have to agree with what they do, but you know that other person, even when they're doing terrible, bad things, they're also a facet of the Creator, just like you are. Everyone is a facet of the Creator. Everything is ultimately a unity. And that unity splits itself into infinite pieces for the purpose of experience. And some of those experiences include darkness. And that's just one of the biases of some of the facets of the Creator. Those biases reflect the infinite variety that's within source consciousness. Some are attracted to light, to radiation, and some are attracted to darkness, to absorption. But those are both poles of the same thing. And that difference, that tension that's created between the positive and the negative, allows work. It allows work to occur. And the work is our growth and our learning. That's the work that's happening. You're elevating your state of consciousness. And if you view other people that are doing things that you don't agree with, if you view that as it's friction, but that friction provides you an opportunity to learn, then I think it's easier to understand and it's easier to accept. It's very important to not let hatred, get into you and get into your heart, because then you will also start to corrupt yourself, and then you will also start to go down the dark path. And even though it can be so difficult to understand, like, why would someone, choose that? Well, you have to respect free will. That's one of the most important defining features, I think, of being oriented more towards service to others, is that you respect their free will. And they have the choice to take the dark path. It's perfectly legitimate. So when I say that evil is also love, evil is the love of self. But the love of self is also love. And even if you are oriented more towards service to others, or at least you're trying to be, I'm trying. I'm not getting there, but I'm trying. When you serve others, you also serve yourself. So don't think that you're so much better necessarily than someone who's entirely selfish, because everyone is serving themselves in some way. It's just some people have the bias that they really, really focus on that, 100%. So every being, as they go through this growth, this development of consciousness, whether this takes one life or many, many lives, will eventually come to the realization that they are the creator. And I mean that they are a facet of the creator, that they are part of the creator, and the creator is looking through their eyes. And when you have that realization, I think there's two possible ways that you can respond to it. One is to realize that I am the creator and everything else is the creator as well. Therefore, service to others. Therefore, I should help and I should be of service to the entire creation because the entire creation is me. We're all part of the same thing. We're all part of the one unity, and we're all descended from this source consciousness. But some people, when they have that realization and they realize, I am the creator. The creator's looking through my eyes. Then they say, that means that everything else is here to serve me. And that is the service to self path. And as difficult as that is for me to agree with, it is perfectly legitimate to take that view and to take that path. Now, again, that doesn't mean you have to let them do whatever they want. You can defend yourself. You can push back. You can defend those, that you love. And I think it's important to do that. You can stand on your own, and you can look them in the eye. You say, "Yeah, not with me. That's not gonna. That doesn't fly here." But you have to do it without judgment, because the service to others path is not morally superior, in the true sense, to the service to self path. And I know some people say, "Oh no, you're justifying evil." No. The source consciousness is exploring all paths. Everything is part of the source consciousness. So every person that you look at and that you say, "Oh, that person is terrible," don't judge, because they're also a part of the creator, just like you. They just have a different bias. They have a different view of things. And again, that doesn't mean that you let them do whatever they want, and that doesn't mean that you let them hurt people necessarily. You can defend. It's a tricky thing to balance compassion with, self-defense. But when you do it, you have to do it without letting hate grow in you. That is a mistake. You have to do it without judgment. You just have to do it in a very matter-of-fact way. And I think a really good example of this is, I encourage you to read the Zeta interviews. As I've said before, I think it's going to go down in history. I think it's the most important book ever written, or certainly one of the most important books ever written. And the Zeta are a really amazing race because they're highly, highly ethical and highly compassionate. But they're very, very matter of fact. They're very, very technical. And they had their own problem with a negative race. And they had the surface of their planet was destroyed in a conflict. And the Zeta defended themselves, and they reached, some sort of peace and some sort of, status quo that maintains the peace. But when you hear them describe it, they do it without hatred. They do it without, there's no desire for revenge. There's no, there's no pitying themselves that this happened. They see it just as, they understand that the other race, the negative race, is also part of source consciousness. And it's also exploring infinite possibilities. But they're very matter of fact about it, and they're very practical. So they defend themselves, and they take steps to make sure that race doesn't do too much harm to other people. But they realize that everyone has free will, and everyone can choose the way that they are going to go through this creation and the way that they're going to exercise that free will. So the light and the dark, that's radiation and absorption. That's positive and negative, like on a magnet. You can't have a magnet without having a positive and negative. And so part of what this reality of good and evil does is it creates this contrast. And that contrast creates a very vivid experience. And everyone here, on this planet now is living through that experience. And it is very, very vivid. It can be very, very intense because you have the highs and the lows, and you see the good and the evil. You see both sides of things, and you see how some people choose one way and some people choose another way. And it creates it creates an experience that I think without having that full range of possibilities, it wouldn't be as strong and as vivid of an experience. And therefore, it wouldn't be as good for learning, and it wouldn't be as good for growth. This type of challenge is important for growth. So in some way, even though the people that choose a negative path, they cause a lot of harm and damage, and and I get as frustrated with it as anyone else. To some degree, they are providing us the opportunity to learn and to understand our path better, because that's also part of you. And I think if you're honest, I think that there's very, very few people that have ever existed that have been entirely good. And you can see that inside yourself, that you can see that you also have that tendency. You just try to not express that bias, and you try to direct your thoughts and your actions more towards a positive path. But that's inside of you, because you also are a facet of the source consciousness, and the source consciousness contains everything. It contains all of it. And some people, as they go through this illusion, some people focus more on the concept of separation, and that is what the service to self path is. They focus on everything is separation, and therefore everything is separated from me, so I can lie and manipulate and I can do terrible things because that is there to serve me. All those other people and all those other things are there to serve me, and they see the separation. They focus more on the separation. And the separation, from one standpoint, it is there, but I think the benefits, and I think why in the end, the service to other path, I think everyone has to eventually, no matter how long it takes, come to see that service to others is the right way, is because ultimately that separation isn't there. That separation is just part of the illusion. And even though, again, the word illusion, it's a good word, but you got to be careful. It's subtle, but I think it's legitimate to say illusion when you understand the proper context, which is, it's an illusion from the viewpoint of the ultimate reality. But when you're inside of it, boy, it's not an illusion. When you're inside of it, it's very, very real. Pain is very, very real. Suffering is very, very real, and you feel it. But when you decide that you want to focus more and try to grow more along the path of service to others, it's a recognition that there is no separation. The separation is part of the illusion. And you pierce the illusion. And you pierce the illusion by recognizing that and not playing along with that. And that means that you have to have compassion for everyone, for everything, because everything is part of the source consciousness, including the negative groups, the negative people, the people that have chosen darkness. They're also part of the one source consciousness. There is no escaping that, and you just have to accept it. And the challenge for us is to not let that corrupt us and not let that turn us into another version of them. Because then ultimately, then you lose. If you allow yourself to become hateful and vengeful and violent, then you've also chosen the path of darkness, and the path of separation. So that's one of the things that I love so much about the Zeta interviews, is that you can see that even for a civilization that gets very, very advanced, this is always a dilemma, and it's always an ethical conundrum. How do you balance compassion with self-defense? Because just because you recognize that those negative groups are also part of the one source consciousness, it doesn't mean that you have to let them walk all over you. And it doesn't mean that you have to let them control you and enslave you. It's legitimate to defend yourself and to fight back. But you have to do it, as much as you can, not from a place of hatred. And that was the message of Jesus. I think that's what love your enemies means. They're your enemies, but that doesn't mean that you have to hate them. They're just here pursuing their path. You can take action, but you don't have to hate them. And that's obviously very, very difficult for me. It's extremely difficult, especially when you see the true nature of the things that are going on, among humans. And then when you think about what could be behind this, and you think about negative groups of ETs, there's extraterrestrials that are behind a lot of this. Oh man, I get really, really mad, and it's like, okay, they could take advantage of us now, but we're going to get more powerful, and then we'll see. Then we'll have a little bit of a reckoning, but that's not a good way to think. Ultimately, that's not going to lead to a good place. So I think it's going to be, a struggle for us. It's a struggle for each one of us individually, day by day. It's going to be a struggle for our society for a very long time. I think it takes a long time to grow out of that. But I think it's something that's important. It's important for us to just keep in mind as we're going through this, that, you can get upset, and it's difficult to understand, but there is a purpose and there is a reason. And it's not that this is a prison planet and that we're being punished or, we're enslaved by someone else. It's simply that this is part of what this experience is all about. You have to go through the light and the dark, and that contrast is what helps you learn. And that creates the friction that enables growth and learning. And eventually, all paths lead back to the Creator. There is no avoiding it. Everything goes back to source consciousness. Everything goes back to the One. You can decide how long you're going to take to get there. You're an infinite being. If you want to take a detour and you want to take a path of darkness for a long time, that's up to you. I think eventually you're going to have to recognize the unity of everything. But for those of us who are trying to get there maybe hopefully a little bit quicker, we just have to accept that we can't force our will on others. They have free will too. And part of being oriented towards the positive polarity and the positive side of things is that you have to respect other people's free will, and you have to allow them to make their own decisions and to find their own way through things. And you can't take away their free will. And if that means that they're negative and they're evil and they're doing terrible things, then separate yourself from them, contain them, take steps to protect yourself and to defend yourself, but let them work through their issues. And they got to work through it, on their own. You can try to support, you can try to help and provide guidance when possible, but ultimately, you have to let free will play out, because the source consciousness is letting free will play out with us. And, none of us are perfect either. And it's actually kind of an interesting, it's an interesting thing when you realize that it's a good thing that these advanced races have a lot of compassion towards the human race, because we're no angels either. And there's a lot of things that we've done already that have been very damaging and destructive here, to ourselves, to the planet, probably to other races already. I mean, it appears to be the case that we're already doing bad things. So thankfully, those other races understand where we are in our process of growth, and they understand that we also are going through this learning process, and they have compassion for it. And so they segregate us, they contain us, they try to help and support us, but ultimately they let us work through our issues on our own. And that is, I think, the proper and the ethical approach. It's to respect free will. But just because you respect free will doesn't mean you have to let yourself get taken advantage of. And hopefully we grow out of this, and hopefully the other people that are here right now on the planet, other groups of humans and other groups of NHI that are doing terrible things, hopefully we can defend ourselves from them, contain it, separate ourselves, and they grow out of their, they work through their issues. And however long it takes them, well, that's how long it's going to take them. But for us, it's just important to, while we're working through our problems and they're working through their problems, not become hateful and not become negative people ourselves, because that's, I think, the biggest danger. If you do that, it's not that someone's going to come in and judge you, but it's just that you're holding yourself back. And, you may as well just grow and grow in the proper way. And to do that, you have to have compassion, and you have to let go of all hate, as hard as that is. So anyways, guys, I hope that kind of makes sense. It's a difficult topic, and it's one that I think about a lot and that I struggle with, especially, like I said, in this day and age when there's so many crazy things happening. But but it's part of reality, and we just have to deal with it, and face it and confront it head on. And there's no sense in hiding from it. And I think that as we learn even more about what the things that are going to come out, with just the reality of life on this planet and what's been happening for thousands of years, and we're not alone, and there's other groups of ETs here, and they've been here for a while. I think that we're going to learn there's been a lot of bad things that have happened, but that was all part of our growth, and we can't let that sour us and turn us into some sort of negative race ourselves. So, anyways, guys, if you have any comments, please drop down below. Always happy to talk. Bye, guys.